I have a lot to talk about here, and even as I write this, I've still got no idea if I can really articulate the multitude of thoughts and feelings I have about this story and this world. Part of this comes from not wanting to spoil anything, and another part is that Disco Elysium simply doesn't fit into any of the boxes of regular RPGs. The narrative and mechanics are so well intertwined that I feel like I'd be doing them an injustice by separating them out and picking them apart one at a time, as if I were some emotionless cyborg sent from the future, slowly dissecting a living human being as it writhes on an operating table, while I examine each and every organ and sinew and try to decipher which one is responsible for love, laughter, and happiness. Where the hell did that metaphor come from? Okay, no problem. It'll never make it past the editor.
This seems like a well thought out and worthwhile addition to the script that everyone will understand and no one will think you're the slightest bit strange for conjuring up in your imagination. Best leave it in.
You're the boss, man. That doesn't mean I'm not going to try, but I suspect a lot of this is going to have some degree of back and forth, and a few points might get repeated along the way. I think a lot of what I'm feeling is best demonstrated by example though. This means that I'll be doing a couple of scene studies, one of which will be from a critical path interaction. I'll do my very best to limit context and avoid spoilers. Certainly nothing major will pop up, but just a heads up if you haven't played this masterpiece and you're looking to go in relatively blind. For all the love I have for this game, it definitely isn't perfect, and it definitely isn't for everyone. It succeeds on its own merits, effectively executing everything it sets out to do with style and grace, and yet, there were definitely times I was skipping through dialogue just to get to the next part of the game, and we'll be talking more about the hows, whats and whys of that later. Whatever else though, it's been a hell of a ride from me buying this game in the Christmas sales a year ago to finally finish it and writing this extended review of it. There were several false starts along the way, and I almost didn't finish it this time either. So, with all that said, why don't we set the tone for this somewhat differently structured conversation? Rather than me saying this is and the game name instead, let me tell you a story. The question that exists at the core of Disco Elysium is the single greatest mystery that any person will be faced with in their entire lives, and quite possibly one of the scariest ones to explore. That being the question of who am I? If I answer with my name, then the universe replies with, who were you before you had that name? If I describe myself, it says, but you haven't always looked this way. Once, your hair was longer. You were shorter. You didn't have those tired rings under your eyes. So, were you the same person then? If I talk about my actions, my hopes and my dreams, it replies, but these are fickle, changing things. They are not who you are. They are simply what you do and what you want now. And if I talk about my memories and my experiences that have brought me to where I am now, it merely replies as before, that my actions are only a reflection of what I did in a moment. They don't define who I truly am. So, in effect, are my dreams important? Could I change what I desire and still be me? Certainly, it seems like I've done it many times. How about my memories then? Fickle, fancy things that are misty and untrustworthy. How important are they really? What if they were to all just vanish one day? This is a very real conundrum that our protagonist, who I'll be referring to as the detective from now on, is faced with as we begin our game literally staring into the void and on the very verge of plunging into it forever. In the eternal blackness we hear the chiding and frankly painful to listen to voices of something called the ancient reptilian brain and the limbic system. They seem so happy to have arrived here, as if they had finally come to the end of a long and arduous journey, and are now at their very resting spot, where they hope to remain forever. Assuming we don't succumb to the desire to remain down here with them, and bring down an immediate game over screen. Yes, that's a thing that can happen. The lights slowly come up to reveal a room that has been utterly destroyed, and the equally ruined body of our hero. It's no secret at this point that Disco Elysium is the game about the guy who got so blackout drunk one night he completely erased his memory. I suspect this hook alone was responsible for piquing the curiosity of more than just your average CRPG enjoyers. The hero with amnesia is kind of a tired trope at this point, but like any other writing trope, it's just a tool, which means it can be implemented well or poorly. It's just a matter of the writer and their intentions. So let's just stop to think about how insane that hook is for a moment. While we've had more than our fair share of playable characters who somehow got a mind wipe, Disco Elysium's protagonist didn't get a serious concussion in some awesome battle, or crash land in a spaceship or head-on collision with a car. There's no forbidden alchemical potions lying around his room when he wakes up, or ominous note telling him not to try and remember. And he wasn't strapped to a cold steel table in some abandoned lab. No. He just got so shit-faced that he all but wiped his entire life. Who the hell does that? And how? Is this the ultimate party boy? Maybe not looking at those underpants.
Fucking talking about underpants.
Is he some kind of depressed person? His place is an absolute wreck after all. Was he here alone when this happened? Was there a party? More importantly, where the hell are we even? So this utter wreck of a man slowly stumbles around his hotel room, nurturing the mother of all hangovers, and trying to piece together something that looks like an outfit from the few remaining clothes scattered around the apartment. Meanwhile, multiple voices jabber on in his head, filling him in on details that he shouldn't know. I'm not gonna lie, this whole scene is painful. It's slow and arduous, and our hero plods step by step around the place, winces at the bright light, and somehow, through some deeply rooted and highly practiced ability embedded in his psyche, is able to extrapolate that the broken window in his room could be connected to his missing shoe. The constant jabbering voices are the broken shards of the detective's psyche. They seem to be all that survived what may very well have been a serious attempt at ending his own life. And even from the word go, you just can't help but wonder what it was that brought this guy to this place. What roads did he travel down to finally arrive here? And what could be so utterly horrible that he'd choose this method out of all other possibilities to deal with it? This is indeed the primary conflict in the game. While we soon discover, or are at least identified as a detective in the Revachol Citizens Militia, sent here to investigate a lynching, the true mystery at play here is the identity of our protagonist, how he came here, and indeed, is there anywhere for him to go after this? So let's step out of the ruined hotel room for a minute and see if we can't untangle some of what we just saw. Don't worry, we are definitely diving back into the narrative elements of this game, but it's all far too tangled up in the mechanics, which is both wonderful and also kind of depressing. There are so few games out there that are really taking full advantage of the media's potential like this one, and seamlessly weaving the storytelling into the gameplay. Not that I have a problem with cutscenes exactly. I did just finish a game series that was almost entirely cutscenes, but I really think we could be doing so much more, and Disco Elysium is an example of exactly why we should be doing more, and how to go about doing it. At its core, Disco is an RPG that maintains an isometric camera view and uses pre-rendered backgrounds similar to many of the legendary old CRPGs of the day, and that's about where the resemblance ends. For one thing, Disco doesn't have any kind of combat loop. I mean, there are a few fights in the game, but they are managed through a simple skill check system versus some elaborate real-time or turn-based mode that influences most if not all of your choices concerning equipment and how to progress your character when they level up. At the start of the game, much like any other, you're tasked with rolling a character. You're always going to be this guy, but the archetype you choose or make for yourself will inform us somewhat about maybe what kind of person he was before his mind-altering binge and what fragments of his mind have survived in a better state than others. The basic archetypes are thinker, sensitive, and physical, and I think we can all pretty much imagine what kind of guy each of these represents. In terms of fantasy roleplay, the thinker is going to be closer to a wizard, or in crime fiction terms, he's going to be your Hercule Poirot type, who's all IQ, no social intelligence, and pretty useless in a fight. Well, Holmes could box, I suppose. The sensitive is your more charismatic type character. Think a bard in D&D. Someone who's good at talking and picking up on subtle cues that give people away. Maybe in another life he'd be a high-stakes poker player or a performance mentalist like Derren Brown. The physical guy is your classic thug. He's going to be your fighter or barbarian type in fantasy, the kind of guy whose idea of police work is kicking down doors and getting bumped down to traffic duty for insubordination, before being reluctantly brought back onto the special task force because no one else but him has got the balls to do whatever it is the script calls for him to do. As to how these classes translate into stats and abilities, well, permit me to introduce you to the real genius at the core of Disco Elysium. The skill system. Far from being a system of arbitrary stats and skills with numbers that do something connected to something else, Disco draws its skills from the broken pieces of the detective's psyche and lets you put points into them so that they can chime in during his inner monologue and offer their oh-so-important advice on any situation you might find yourself in. And believe me, their advice is important. After all, they tell you as much all the time, so why wouldn't it be?
You know these guys? Who? Me? Yes, you. He's talking about you, you boring stiff. You too. Me? What did I do? I'm merely a master thespian.
These are the conflicting voices that we hear jabbering away in our protagonist's head during his waking moments, and what they say is going to have a real bearing on how you go about playing this game. During dialogues and while walking around the city, a lot of passive checks take place. A passive check simply checks your total skill level with one of the various voices in our hero's head against a difficulty number, and if the skill is higher, extra dialogue becomes available from that part of his mind, and can lead to extra conversation options that can help you talk people into corners, call them out for lying, or simply make snappy conversation and win them over. You might be thinking, oh wow, that's real simple. And yeah, you're kinda right. But let's not confuse simple and easy. There's nothing easy about any of this. And given the degree of reactivity in this game, I'd say there wasn't anything especially easy about putting it all together either. So with that taken care of, let's head back into our hotel room and maybe progress a little bit from there. I mentioned before about the passive checks, but there are also active ones. For our incredibly fragile detective, something as simple as pulling a tie down from a spinning fan could have potentially life-threatening consequences. But assuming we survive the simple act of putting on our clothes and exiting the room, we're faced with this young lady here and a chance to be a very smooth-talking motherfucker. A chance I blew immediately, which is where another very important lesson presented itself. Unlike most RPGs that are more than happy to judge you on your actions and have some concept of a better or worse outcome, Disco Elysium wants you to fail forward. This game is really funny at times, and some of the absolute funniest moments come when you fail a check.
Not so fast. You owe me 130 real.
One moment you're running like the wind. Then you've suddenly turned around and are giving him the finger, furiously, with both hands. Why?
Watch out!
But there's a lot more to it than that. Most games have a concept of succeeding or failing at something, or even go so far as to have some kind of moral system where outcomes can be defined as good or evil. But Disco Elysium doesn't make any such demands of you at all.
Life doesn't have a back button. Now get off your ass and speak the truth about Sylvie the whore.
It does, however, have a very interesting and compelling way of keeping you on the straight and narrow, in the form of this guy right here. Our partner and only other party member on this epic quest is this fairly stiff-looking gentleman right here, Mr. Kim Kitsuragi. Kim is one of the first people we meet in the game. He recognizes the detective by the logo on his jacket, and immediately concludes that this is the person he's supposed to meet here and work with in solving a murder. This murder, to be precise. Now, don't let his stiff pose or somewhat wet blanket-looking portrait fool you. Lieutenant Kim gets down.
Now, check this shit out.
The lieutenant begins to heel kick the church floor.
Well, until he doesn't anyway.
Okay, this is too imbecilic. Excuse me.
In Japan, there's a kind of comedy double act called manzai. This is your typical Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy type setup where there's a serious guy and a complete buffoon working through a situation, and the comedy ensues from the juxtaposition of the two characters' personalities and the violent outburst directed by the straight guy onto the fool. This is basically Kim and our hero here, minus the violent outbursts. I'll let you take a wild guess at which one of the two we are. This is important for a lot of reasons. I think we've all watched a buddy cop movie or two in our time, so we know how this goes, and we know who we are in this dynamic. As such, you may find yourself inclined to play this game a very specific way. Like, maybe the dumbest way you can possibly imagine.
You're going to pull his head off.
Generally speaking, at least on a first playthrough, I'm usually a very vanilla RPG guy, but not this game. Well, kinda. You see, the detective here is something of a lost and damaged puppy to me, and while I could sense from the get-go that he'd done this to himself and had I met him a day earlier, I might have hated his guts, I really wanted to take care of him. An example of this involves one of our little personality quirks here, electrochemistry. Think of this as the demon on your shoulder. On one hand, he's very knowledgeable on the topic of drugs and chemicals, as any police officer might be. But this knowledge clearly extends into the realms of personal use, and not just a casual sniff during a wild party.
Maybe you haven't turned out well for your drinking. Have you thought about that? Get a goddamn rum and lemonade to yourself, boy. Or better yet, lick that stain off the counter.
I won't lie, I really wanted to lick that liquor off the bar and see what became of this, but I just couldn't do that to him. The game gave me autonomy. It let me make a choice, and I just saw something damaged and wanted to take care of it. As such, I actually passed up on learning about a useful game mechanic for quite some time. The various stimulants you can stumble across in the game can be used to upgrade stats and boost checks at the cost of damaging health. It was only much later in the game that my curiosity and a desire to tick some quests off from my journal got the better of me, and I finally sampled some wine and cigarettes and learned about this mechanic. Don't go thinking I wasn't having any fun though. I still found myself screaming obscenities into a phone, getting distracted from the case so that I could paint a beautiful message on this wall, dancing around the topic of my sexuality with this mesmerizing young man, investigating the mystery of a powerful curse that supposedly haunts this building, and going hunting for cryptids. That's like searching for Bigfoot for those of you that don't know. All the while, I've got this guy's sour face staring down at me and occasionally commenting on just how much time we're wasting. Sounds annoying, right? Well, to quote a far better game critic than myself on this subject, let me just say that Lieutenant Kim is bae. Kim isn't just some spoilsport straight-faced cop here to ruin all your fun. He's actually a complex character with a lot of experiences, feelings, and motivations all of his own. It takes a bit of work to bring him out of his shell and get him talking about it, but that's all part of the charm. Let's take the first day as an example here. Firstly, Kim really doesn't buy into your memory loss story. It seems police officers often have psychological crises and seek to abandon their posts in creative ways. In a stark contrast to a guy who's woken up in a trashed room with no memory, badge, or gun, Kim has all his shit together, and is more than a little distressed about having to deal with yours. Kim is the guy with all the paperwork ready and a pen in hand when the autopsy happens, and he doesn't so much as flinch at the odor of the cadaver, unlike the detective here. All the way through, he seems a little too straight, maybe even a little robotic. Well, that is until this happened.
Ace is high.
The high arrives with a sharp slap. As you turn around, there is a moment of doubt. Feels like that low ain't gonna connect. Chill. It's gonna connect. But then it does.
But there's more. One early game feature that keeps us moving around is needing to pay for our hotel room each night or face a night alone outside in the cold Martinez winter. In truth, with the amount of things we need to take care of just around the hotel on the first day, as well as buying various drugs to sustain our diminutive health pool, you almost certainly aren't going to scrape together enough to pay what you owe on your room, plus another night on top of that. Not to worry though, Kim's got you covered. It seems he recently confiscated some very cool hubcaps from a crime scene, and has yet to turn them over to the proper authorities for processing. How convenient. The sale of these beauties will easily cover the costs. They'd also look absolutely awesome on Kim's automobile. And should you mention that to him, the little guy cracks a smile. So there is a human in there after all. This section is also followed up by the first evening debriefing, where we notice another little quirk. Mr. Kim smokes a single cigarette every day at the end of the day when he's doing his paperwork, the image of which something inside the detective really approves of.
Oh man, he looks so devastatingly cool with that cigarette.
Throughout the game you have a lot of these little moments with Kim, such as sitting on these swings waiting for the tide to go out, so you can go and search through this highly suspicious crashed automobile that some crazy drunk, most likely teenagers, drove into the sea. Here you have the option of just taking up a tune to whistle, and if you do, Kim whistles along with you. Later in the game he comes to truly accept the detective's condition, and even starts to make very deadpan jokes about the many situations the pair find themselves in. All of these little moments serve to make Kim very endearing and even lovable. So much so that you don't actually want to disappoint or let him down. He may look away as you hand speed to a miner, but somehow you know he disapproves, and you actually feel bad about it. And while he doesn't exactly stop the detective from rushing over to investigate every suspicious crate and door, he does serve as a sharp counterpoint to keep them in check, and just make sure they aren't trying to Grand Theft Auto their way through this whole thing. The pair go through a lot together. When Kim loses his cool in the face of blatant racism, I felt an overwhelming desire to back him up. When this sleazy union boss tried to cozy up to me by all but cutting Kim out of the conversation, I took an even stronger disliking to him. And when I broke into someone's house as a scare tactic for part of a mission, I immediately lost any sense of guilt about it when Kim pointed out the collection of racist mugs the person kept, and added that maybe this guy isn't such a great person after all. Kim's great. He never berates you for your antics, no matter how bizarre. He may apologize to someone on your behalf, but he never shakes his finger or belittles you. The most important thing about Kim is that he's always got your back, no matter what. We later discover that he seems to look up to the 41st precinct that the detective comes from, and comments that it's one of the hardest places to work in Revachol. Despite an ongoing pissing contest between their two precincts, Kim has a lot of respect for those he should see as his enemies. He's humble, he's cool, and he's eternally patient. Honestly, we all need a bro like Kim in our lives. Someone who, rather than judge us when we fail, simply shows us a better example for us to aspire towards. Someone who's got our back when the chips are down, who'll literally drag our bloodied bodies out of a war zone, who knows exactly how to act when things get serious, and even has time to crack a joke in the bleakest of moments. There aren't that many Kim Kitsuragis in the world, so if you've managed to find one, make sure you hold on to them, and don't neglect them. Our two sleuths are investigating the case of the hanged man in the small town of Martinez that hangs off the very edge of the country of Revachol. And, oh wow, does this place tell a story. In the past, Martinez was set up to be some kind of retro sci-fi Silicon Valley, complete with a seaside boardwalk and a magnificent Ferris wheel. But the world had other ideas, and now all that's left is a parasite-ridden, burnt-out husk. Martinez is a place that fell through the cracks and was forgotten about after Revachol experienced a political upheaval some 50 or so years ago. Enough time to be a distant memory, but not so long that many of the characters we meet remember it all too well. It began when the masses became dissatisfied with their coke fiend of a king and launched a full-blown communist revolution, overthrowing the monarchy and establishing a new system of government in its place. Since getting a download on life is both a mission and something really important for the detective to figure out, I'll omit most of the details here and leave them for you to discover for yourself by playing the game. Suffice to say though, this communist revolution went about as well as any other communist revolution.
Generally speaking, 40 million people got shot in the head during the World Revolution. But the communists, they all got shot in the head.
And the disarray that followed paved the way for a greater power known as the Coalition of Nations to sweep in and, let's say, liberate Revachol from the grueling task of governing itself in a campaign known as Operation Death Blow. As you can imagine, this political maneuver was backed up with guns. Lots of guns. Absolutely massive guns. Some of which still sit off the shore of Martinez even now, as if waiting for the first sign of an uprising to rear its head again. As a prime spot for landing, Martinez had the absolute living crap shelled out of it. And even after Martinez surrendered its sovereignty, the commune never officially surrendered. There was years of guerrilla warfare, with remnants who were hiding in the vast network of tunnels and underground bunkers that had been dug into the city and filled with supplies and weapons for just such an occasion. So it's been quite a few decades here, and the remains of this incredibly violent and bloody transition of power can still be seen all around the small town. These come in obvious ways such as collapsed and blasted buildings, or in more subtle ways like walls lined with bullet holes symbolizing places where many people were lined up and met their deaths. All around the town there is rot and decay, and getting out towards the beach, it only gets worse. Here the crumbling structures are replaced with shacks seemingly formed from scavenged materials and held together with rotting rope and duct tape. Though they aren't without their warmth or charm. One such small haven can even become a resting place for our lost and broken protagonist, given to him freely, out of the kindness of another old soul, and is actually quite a cozy little place to escape to. Beats the hell out of this dump. So uncivilized. But, I hear you ask, wasn't this war 50 years ago? Why haven't things been put to rights? Hiroshima, after all, was hit with a nuclear bomb in the 40s, but it's not like it was some kind of blasted wasteland in the 90s. Well, it seems to be deliberate. Maybe on account of all the trouble the guerrillas gave to the coalition, Martinez was left to rot. No money was invested into its repair, and it existed at a strange crossing point between two police precincts who chose petty politics over serving and protecting people. It soon became a haven for the hopelessly lost and organized criminals, finally falling under the jurisdiction of the Dock Workers Union and policed by their brigade of thugs, the Hardy Boys. We'll talk a little more about these guys later, as they do play an important part in the narrative. In gameplay terms, Martinez is actually quite a small map. This is because Disco Elysium is an incredibly dense game. And I mean incredibly dense. A single interaction with all its various routes and outcomes can take up an hour or more of your time, and I've no doubt it could be quite different depending on your character archetype and build. So, we don't have a sprawling map full of dungeons to delve into and mountains to climb, just a small area of the town, the docks, and the seafront to work with. You've probably already figured out that these wonderful backgrounds are all pre-rendered, and have been crafted with a meticulous painterly style that just stirs something inside me. Everything about these environments is just jaw-droppingly beautiful, while simultaneously hopelessly depressing, which is something of a theme for this entire game, and oddly fitting for the story of a man who destroyed his mind and is now trying to, tentatively, put it back together. It's winter, and the weather flicks from rain to snow to dreary grey skies that call to mind being back in the UK. All around we can see rot and destruction. There are bombed out buildings full of collapsing walls and other kinds of damage. That being said, the rooms that remain intact are cramped and depressing. This is the land of the blind and the poor, who try to etch out some kind of existence in squalor, while rich vultures waiting for the final collapse hang about on the edge, ready to swoop in and buy up all the cheap land. You might think maybe it would be better if they did, and yet, every now and then, you stumble into a house or a room, or talk to someone and just see the shards of a good life. Not an easy life by any means, but one that's all their own, that they've made for themselves through hard work and the sweat off their brows. These little rooms may be cramped, and the buildings they inhabit may be dangerous, but it's theirs. So, why should anyone else tell them it's not good enough and try to take it from them? How can we truly know that what these vultures would offer is any better for them? The whole thing is beautifully depressing. Or depressingly beautiful, I'm not sure which. And the music, written and performed by the incredible band Sea Power, only serves to enhance this even more. While I've said before that I lack the vocabulary to talk in any way about the structure or composition of music, I can tell you how a particular piece or soundtrack makes me feel. The music to Disco Elysium feels like commuting to work on a crowded train on a cold and rainy Monday morning. On the surface, that might sound like one of the most depressing experiences you can have. Even as someone who basically enjoys their job, I can tell you I loathe dragging myself out of bed at 5:45 AM on a Monday, and that it's a feeling that only gets amplified with every step I take away from the comfort of my home, my computer, and the various creative pursuits that make me truly happy. Standing there on the train, I'm surrounded by so many exhausted and miserable people who maybe squeezed a little too much fun out of the all too short weekend and are now regretting it or just despairing at how far away they are from their next chance at a little freedom. Everyone is silent. Heads are bowed or buried in phones, books, or lolling in a half-asleep state. It all seems so hopeless, and you'd be tempted to ask, where did we all go wrong? That is until you take a step back and you see that all of us gathered there in that moment are in fact sharing the same experience. We are equally despairing at the injustice of work and tax inflicted on us by a society centuries before we were even born, and we're all probably exaggerating this just a little too. We know that just as surely as work will start, it will also end, and that it, usually, won't be even half as bad as we think it will. All those people looking at their phones are just snatching a few minutes with the life they love, be it playing a game, looking at pictures taken with friends, sharing a message with those dearest to them, reading a book or a comic, browsing for something on Amazon, or just watching something that puts a smile on their face and reminds them that even Monday mornings aren't so bad. Here we are, all collectively suffering, but more importantly, just sharing this experience called life, with its many ups and downs and bumps and bruises. And while we may step off the train and be greeted with a horrific downpour, it's just as likely that the clouds will break and the sun will shine through to greet us. For indeed, for every Monday morning, there is a Saturday night. For every tedious job our boss lays at our feet, there are nights spent alone, drawing, writing, playing music, and just lost in the rapture of creativity and passion. And for every cold, lonely train commute, there is time spent with friends and loved ones, scored by the sound of great music, the taste of delicious food, and punctuated by the deep, rumbling sound of laughter. So we've managed to get our detective downstairs, we've met Kim, and we're on our way to solve a murder. How do we do that? Why, with conversation trees, of course. So, if you watch my series on The Longest Journey or maybe my vampire video, you may be aware that I'm not a big fan of conversation trees, and Disco Elysium is all conversation trees. In fact, it wouldn't be a stretch to call this a text-based adventure game with some nice presentational touches. So clearly I hate it, right? Well, no, not even slightly. Yes, I think some of these do go on a little too long, and I did end up skimming some sections, but overall, I was hooked from start to finish. So, what does Disco Elysium do that so many games with conversation trees don't? To put it simply, just about everything that happens in a conversation tree in this game matters. And these guys are the reason why it matters. So yes, as with every other dialogue tree, you're going to start out with a huge list of topics to click through, and you're basically just going to go clickety-clicking from top to bottom, listening to all the dialogue and moving on from there. Where things start to get interesting is the skills you've acquired and the way this information is presented. On this specific run, I was a thinker. So the majority of my powers came from these guys, with Encyclopedia doing most of the heavy lifting at the start, and the others waking up and becoming more active as I put more points into them. My motoric skills were my second strongest suite, which is how I was able to pass this very difficult red check, shoot down this body, and skip a few hours of game. We'll get to that, trust me. My weaker skills were my physique and psych, though I put some points into volition and endurance to boost my incredibly minimal health and morale pools, and survive exchanging more than 2 sentences with this little brat. And again, more on that later. I unexpectedly wound up with a fairly high Shivers score, which was actually one of the highlights of the game for me. While Shivers does have some things to add to conversations, it is at its best during these odd little monologues that you can stumble into as you walk around. Shivers is your connection to the greater universe, the understanding that you are part of something bigger and more interconnected than you could possibly understand. It also draws on a lot of the detective's latent memories, bringing them out to help him envision places far away and see in his mind's eye what people are doing there. Shivers is that little moment of clarity, somewhere between being asleep or awake, when just for a moment you can see it all and it all makes sense. As though we have spread our wings, soared above the clouds and the chaos of the tiny world we inhabit and all its erratic connections, and we now see the total picture that forms. And we see something harmonious and beautiful beyond words. And we know that each and every tiny little piece, no matter how infuriating they may be to us, each piece is necessary. Because even if one of those pieces wasn't there, then what is would be something else. So Shivers is great. I did, however, miss out on Inland Empire this game. We had an interesting moment where I wound up talking to the corpse of the victim through this incredibly weird little intuition, but not too many other moments. He's actually my primary reason for wanting to do a replay. Kinda like how after you finish Bloodlines with a vanilla character, you've gotta do that Malkavian and Nosferatu run to see how weird shit can get. So, maybe you can see why these skills and these conversations are so important. It's because Disco Elysium isn't actually afraid to hold back some of its game from you. In fact, it would be impossible to see it all in a single run. The points you spend matter because they completely alter the way your detective sees and interacts with the world, and as such have a massive impact on what dialogue options you have, and even how much work you have to put into solving certain parts of the case. Let's go back to me shooting down that corpse. Even as someone with high-level hand-eye coordination, that was an even chance shot. And if I'd failed, then I'd have to wait a day for these guys to turn up in the whirling, so I could get their help getting this body down and finally do my autopsy. Likewise, if my savoir faire hadn't been high enough for me to make this jump, I'd have had to deal with this guy. Needing to punch him out? Not gonna happen. Or empathizing with his rather, shall we say, interesting racial views, to convince him I was cool enough to let past. Now, regardless of how you go about doing it, you're always going to wind up at the same place. But these choices have a significant impact on how you get there. These choices actually matter, and this is where I made my main mistake playing the game. You see, even after I'd been playing this for a while, I was still in a kind of traditional RPG headspace. In one of those games, if I find a door I can't unlock, then I just level up my lockpicking and try again. The choice doesn't say anything about my character really, it's just a very practical one. I was for a while trying to play Disco Elysium this way, and I found myself having a hard time trying to pass every check in the game and coming up against a wall because my build wasn't this Renaissance man who could brawl, dual-wield flintlocks, had a silver tongue and a sixth sense for danger. I was trying to level up weak skills versus focusing on my build, and Disco Elysium is meant to be played the total opposite way to this. In Disco, putting points into your skills is saying something about the detective as a person, not just what he can do in a pinch. Whatever you're up against, there is basically always a way, which brings us all the way back to Disco Elysium's idea of failing forward. Well, mostly anyway. The game has two kinds of active checks: white checks and red checks. White checks can be retried, red checks are one-shot deals. Now, I will say this, never save scum on a red check. Just go with it. Trust me, it'll be worth it. You could actually be gaining access to several extra hours of game by failing a red check, and you'll have something to uncover on your replay. White checks though, White checks can be pretty annoying at times, and their overall importance can vary. White checks can be retried by putting a point into the related skill when you level up, and you can gain bonuses by learning more things about the situation, talking to people, and changing your clothes. I would actually quit out of conversations a lot to change my gear and go back to take a check. A little scummy, but I like the idea of my dude breaking from a chat mid-sentence and coming back moments later in a completely different outfit, while the other character stares on in bewilderment, and Kim just shakes his head. Even with all that though, failing a lot of these white checks does little more than damage your morale and lock you out until you level up again. And after a while, I was more than happy to save scum my way through a few of these. I did have one problem with this though, and that's with the dialogue lines that can damage your morale pool. Disco Elysium has a health and morale system, and you can get a game over condition if either of these fall to 0. Failing white and even red checks can lead to 1 or sometimes even 2 points of damage. This can be countered by quickly taking some kind of medicine. It's a pretty good system and adds some extra weight to the checks, but what I really didn't like is when a random line of conversation would damage me without warning. It's not such a big deal later in the game when we've got more health and enough drugs to start our own empire, but early game, especially when dealing with this little brat,
Fuck does Kuno care?
it's really annoying, and I'd also call it unfair. By unfair, I mean there's no way to know what will happen beyond trial and error. And when we are talking about losing a considerable amount of gameplay because maybe we didn't save all that recently, to an attack we couldn't see coming, that's pretty shitty. And because it's mostly a problem at the start of the game, when you're at your weakest, well, that's one reason I had to put this down and come back to it a few months later. Think about all those doors in the original Max Payne that have grenades dropped behind them that you have no way to dodge on your first try. Same thing, but you're talking to a 10-year-old with a bad case of potty mouth. So we have this otherwise incredible reactive dialogue system made from a script with over 1 million words, accounting for all the different passive successes you can get based on your skill allotments, and new dialogues you can access based on that. We have one more feature before we put it all together, and it's the one that almost broke the game. That being the Thought Cabinet. The Thought Cabinet comprises pieces of memories and ideas that our newly awakened detective might have about themselves and the world. Some of these are explorations of things he remembers, such as the meaning of the smell of a certain kind of chewing gum, or the detective wondering when he was born, while others are more abstract, such as him being a magnesium-based life form? As the game progresses and events unfold, certain ideas will be presented to the detective, such as this early one for him to get his shit together. Placing the idea into the cabinet will set it ticking over in his mind and incur a penalty for certain checks, implying that that part of his brain is busy internalizing this new idea. Once the time passes and the research is complete, the thought will become permanent, and you'll be granted some flavor text and permanent bonuses. You can spend skill points to sacrifice thoughts, but I wouldn't say any of these are a waste of time. As with skill allotment, this isn't meant to be some way for you to power level through checks. This is evident by the fact you don't know what the final bonus is going to be, or if having certain thoughts in the cabinet will open up more dialogue options versus others. You're just supposed to fill it with things you think the detective would be interested in. So if you want to absorb racist ideologies, or declare yourself to be the last communist in Revachol, you're quite welcome to. The game even points out that just because you know about a certain ideology, it doesn't mean that you follow it. I can sort of see why this one nearly broke the game. It would be easy to bring in a feature like this and let it get out of hand, leading to all kinds of late game broken builds. So, balancing something like this, as well as hiding all the potential thoughts you can acquire and internalize through all the different events in the game, must have been one hell of a challenge. This really speaks to the idea of doing one thing well. By putting all of their energy into conversation trees, and figuring out how to make conversation trees as interesting and meaningful as possible, then writing those conversations really well, and finally get it all voice acted to a top level. There's no way an indie studio would have time to add a crafting system, a stealth system, or a Souls-like combat loop, and if they did, everything would likely feel half-arsed as a result, which is pretty much what happens in most open world sandboxes these days. While Disco Elysium is a dramatization of detective work, this isn't the story of a super sleuth piecing together a tangled web of intrigue from only the most subtle cues and details. Disco Elysium actually seems a lot more like real police work than anything else. As mentioned before, you spend basically all of your time talking to people, and what little time isn't spent talking to people is spent walking around in the rain and the snow looking for people to talk to. Unraveling the mystery then has little to do with realizing there was a secret passage in the kitchen and that the butler faked his death all along, and more to do with just winning people over, talking them into a corner, cross-checking information presented by one person with another, and ultimately getting people to just tell you the truth. From there, you slowly cross off all your dead ends and red herrings and are finally left with one single path. It's painstaking in a way that's almost headbangingly so, especially when so many people seem so dead set against talking to you. As mentioned earlier, Martinez fell through the cracks, and the Dockworkers Union basically runs the show. Early on, you'll have to deal with this mob known as the Hardy Boys. Among other things, they are the de facto militia here in Martinez, and they don't recognize your authority at all. In fact, far from simply not wanting to help you, they seem to be proactively trying to hinder your investigation and present numerous threats of violence and even death along the way. Winning over their cooperation is a big part of the critical path, and it takes time. You're probably going to have to level up your authority a bit and even get the Union boss on your side. I actually have a 2.5 hour section of recorded game that basically involves talking to these guys, running upstairs to talk to another witness, and then running back to talk to them again, basically cross-referencing each of the stories to get the right one. I really meant it when I said this game was dense. I won't spoil any context, but after all this is over, assuming things have gone your way, you've completely talked these guys onto your side, and they can even help out later when taking care of another lost soul you come up against. They repeatedly say that they take care of their own, and it's clear to see that all of that previous hostility stemmed from you being perceived as a threat versus someone actually here to help. Another example, and a section that really hits hard, involves another body you find on the pier looking out over the ocean. This is a side gig, and not connected to the main mission at all. For context though, prior to this, I'd just finished this long and pretty wild mission about some party boys who wanted to open a club in an abandoned church, and it's easily one of my favourite side quests for a lot of reasons. So, after dealing with that insanity, I finally stumble across this guy and oh boy do things take a downward turn from here. You basically have to call it in, and then go and tell the victim's widow of his death, and damn man, this part was extremely heavy. For once, there was no funny dialogue or madcap antics, just pure, straight-faced tragedy. I'm bringing it up because it highlights just how well this is written. Being able to switch up the tone like this is not easy at all, especially when you consider that while this quest and the church club quest are pretty close to each other, there's no way the devs could know the actual order I'd stumble into them in. This is what I mean when I say this is a lot closer to actual police work than in some glamorous detective game. Sure, it's all a little wild and crazy at times, but it's also a slog that can feel extremely frustrating and emotionally draining. Not the game, actual police work I mean. Thank God Kim had my back in that moment. I really don't think I could have done that one without him. I can't tell you what happens at the end of Disco Elysium. Well, I could, but I really don't want to. I can tell you it's satisfying, but maybe not in the way you were expecting. If you were hoping for some big moment of revelation where our hero pulls himself together and presents the particulars of the case to an assembled crowd in the main room of the Whirling in Rags like he's Hercule Poirot, well, you're gonna be a little disappointed there. But it only takes a couple of hours of playing the game to realize that this isn't that kind of detective story. In the final scenes though, both the mystery of our hero's trauma, the root of which is hinted at even from the very beginning, is laid bare, and the perpetrator of the murder we are investigating is unmasked and confesses their crime. And while that final dialogue is very long, stick with it, because I promise you, this game hasn't ran out of surprises even at this point. What I especially liked though was that nothing was wasted. None of the side content was there just because. From dealing with this little gremlin in the yard behind the Whirling, to getting a download on the history and situation in Revachol and Martinez, to helping these kids start their own club in an abandoned church, playing balls with this guy wearing an old royalist uniform, or even helping to find imaginary cryptids. In the end, when you understand it all matters. It all makes sense. Maybe this is what it would be like to look at the universe through the eyes of an omnipotent being, and far from seeing any single thing as insignificant or worthless, seeing how the whole picture comes together into one beautiful harmony. The interesting thing though is this. Even after watching the credits roll, I still can't tell you who our hero is. I don't think I could tell you that even after 100 replays, or if I had access to some special developer mode that let me play the whole game with max skills and stats from the start, and hear every line of dialogue from every possible outcome in a single run. Why, you ask? Because I don't think we're really even supposed to know. Like any great gaming protagonist, this detective has had enough of their character left out for us to fill in with ourselves. His often strange and erratic actions are there for us to interpret and draw our own conclusions from. In this way, just as we all see something a little different in the mirror to what everyone else sees when they look at us, maybe we all find something a little different when we watch this guy stumble around Revachol trying to be a detective. So while I can't tell you who our hero is, I can tell you who he is to me. The detective is a tired, old, and desperately fragile soul who has spent a very long time systematically destroying himself. While there are outside forces to lay the blame of his condition on, he is absolutely his own worst enemy, and he's been letting it win for far too long. He's a deeply emotional soul who's not shy about sharing his feelings with the world. He's an artist, a dancer, and he's a little useless with the ladies. He's an addict, a drinker and a smoker. He's so desperately weak and frail that even a chair can hurt him. And yet, despite all that, when literally everything was taken from him, something still decided to keep going. Something inside, rather than flee from the terrifying force that led to him purging his own mind, wanted to know, wanted to understand, and even showed some semblance of shame at what he'd done to himself. He's a man who, despite not remembering anything about being a detective, solved a murder, who squared up to a larger force of thugs and took them onto his side, and who stood between two warring parties at a crossroads and took a stand for truth and justice in the name of people who hated him and a world that doesn't care for him. He's a good cop, a relentless can opener, who through wits, guile and persistence opens up people to extract what he wants from them, and uses logic to shine light on a mystery and expose the darkness that would dare harm the people of Martinez. He's one hell of a detective. He's Harry Dubois, Lieutenant Double Freighter of the Revachol Citizens Militia. My hero. Well guys, thank you so much. That's it for Disco Elysium, and that's it for 2022. It's been a wonderful year full of surprises and excitement for me. I met and hung out with Jared from Avalanche Games twice, and even flew all the way to Romania to meet a friend whose voice may have turned up in this video, and it's been pretty wild. I'm very excited for 2023 and the arrival of the RE4 remake, and there is definitely some horror games content inbound on this channel in the cold, early months of the year. I'd like to say a huge thank you to the Summer of Mark for lending his voice to the intro of this piece, and his footage of Max Payne taking a grenade to the face, and for generally encouraging me to play this game and cover it on my channel. This one was very challenging, and I think I need to cover things a bit flashier for a while before delving into deeper non-combat narratives again. I'm also not sure how an hour became my average video length, but here we are. I'll say an early happy 2023 to everyone who's made it here, or a late one if you're watching from the future. To everyone who's watched my content and engaged with my channel in any way, thank you. I do this for myself, but it sure is nice having a growing group of people who enjoy what I do. I've especially enjoyed hearing about all of your stories about these games in the comments. Those are probably my favourites. Anyway, I'll be seeing you in January to talk about my 2022 Game of the Year, and no, it's not Elden Ring or God of War. If you follow me on Twitter though, you might already know. For now though, peace out, take care, and stay warm.